from the families I've spoken to who have had to endure suicide is a lot of unanswered questions.
Prince William stood frozen as the document lay open before him. One line, one detail, and suddenly, nothing felt normal anymore. This was never meant to be seen, a voice whispered in his mind. The birth certificate of Archie looked ordinary at first, but what Meghan hid inside it changed everything. William felt the weight of truth press hard against his chest. When Harry finally learned what was missing, what was changed, what was carefully buried, his world shattered. Trust cracked. Silence screamed louder than anger. And this discovery was only the beginning of a royal wound that may never heal. The heir who notices details. Prince William had always been the kind of man who believed in structure. Not the rigid, joyless kind that turned people into machines, but the gentle discipline that came from understanding how fragile things could be. He had learned early that tradition was not just ceremony, it was the thread that held generations together, the quiet agreement that some things mattered more than convenience. He sorted through documents the way his grandmother once reviewed her daily boxes, with care, with patience, with the knowledge that every page carried weight beyond its paper. There was something almost meditative about it. The rustle of aged parchment, the scent of old ink, the steady rhythm of reading and setting aside. He did this work in the early mornings, before the children woke, before the day's obligations crowded in. It was his way of staying connected to what came before him, of honoring the silent compact between past and future. He never rushed. Rushing, he had learned, was how mistakes slipped through. But on this particular morning, his hands stilled. The document before him was nothing extraordinary at first glance. A birth certificate, formal and official, bearing the royal seal. He had seen hundreds like it over the years, yet something about this one refused to settle. The spacing felt wrong, not obviously, not in a way he could name immediately, but wrong nonetheless. He set it down, rubbed his eyes, picked it up again. The feeling remained. William was not a man given to suspicion. He preferred to believe the best of people, to assume good faith until proven otherwise. But he also understood the language of institutions, the way official records spoke in their own careful dialect. And this document, for all its formality, seemed to be whispering rather than declaring. The date sat strangely against other known timelines. Not impossible, but unusual. The wording carried an ambiguity that seemed almost deliberate, as though whoever prepared it had chosen each phrase to create just enough room for interpretation. He traced the margins with his fingertip, noting where signatures fell, where they did not. He thought of his father, who once told him that the worst lies were not the bold fabrications but the quiet omissions, the truths left carefully unspoken. Charles had been speaking about diplomacy at the time, but the principle held. William set the certificate aside and reached for his tea, now cold. Memory has a way of arriving uninvited. As he sat there, other moments began to surface, unbidden, small things, mostly. A conversation that ended too quickly. A question deflected with a smile that did not quite reach the eyes. The way certain topics became suddenly unavailable, cordoned off by pleasantries and schedule changes. He had not thought much of it at the time. The family had always been complicated, always navigating unseen currents. Privacy was currency. Silence was sometimes kindness. But there had been fractures before. He remembered how his mother's struggles had been dismissed as dramatics until they became undeniable. He remembered the cost of looking away, of trusting that things would resolve themselves if only everyone remained calm. The lesson had been brutal. Small omissions do not stay small. They grow in darkness, feeding on what is not said, until they emerge as crises that no amount of composure can contain. William stood and walked to the window. Outside, the gardens stretched in their perfect symmetry, every hedge trimmed, every path deliberate. It looked peaceful. It looked controlled. But he knew that beneath the surface, roots tangled and competed, that what appeared orderly from above was chaos underneath. He did not want to be suspicious. He wanted to file the document away, to trust that if something were truly amiss, someone would have said something. But the feeling persisted, that uncomfortable tightness in his chest that came when instinct and duty pulled in opposite directions. His grandmother had once told him that protecting the institution sometimes meant protecting it from itself, from its own reluctance to face uncomfortable truths. She had said it gently, but he had understood the weight behind her words. The family was not infallible. History proved that. And those who loved it most were sometimes called to ask the questions no one else wanted asked. He returned to his desk and picked up the certificate again. This time, he forced himself to read it not as a grandson or a brother, but as someone trained to see patterns, to notice what did not fit. The language was technically correct, but it danced around certainty. The timing aligned, but only just. It was a document that answered questions while somehow leaving the most important things unsaid. William closed his eyes. He could already feel the path ahead branching. He could choose to set this aside, to trust that whatever irregularities existed were innocent, clerical, meaningless. Or he could look deeper, knowing that once he started, there would be no unknowing what he found. The trouble was, he already knew too much to pretend he knew nothing. The discomfort had taken root, and in his experience, discomfort born from instinct did not fade with time. It grew. He thought about his children, about the world they would inherit. He thought about his brother, about the distance that had grown between them, about the things left unsaid that had hardened into walls. He thought about loyalty, not the blind kind that demanded silence, but the harder kind that demanded honesty, even when honesty hurt. But he had changed in the looking. Something had shifted. And he knew with quiet certainty that he could not simply walk away, not because he wanted confrontation, but because turning away felt like choosing willful ignorance, and he had seen where that led. If he looked deeper, would he still recognize the family he was trying to protect? The question hung in the still morning air, unanswered. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the family worth protecting was not the one that hid from difficult truths, but the one brave enough to face them. He placed the document in a separate folder, apart from the others, not hidden, but set aside, marked in his own quiet way as something requiring more than a cursory glance. The morning light shifted, and somewhere in the house, he heard the first stirrings of the day beginning. William took a breath and turned toward the sound. Whatever came next would come. For now, there was breakfast to share, small hands to hold, ordinary moments that mattered more than any document ever could. But the question remained, patient and persistent, waiting for the moment when he would finally choose to answer it. The silence she chose. Meghan had always been someone who chose her words with care, not because she was calculating, but because she had learned early that words, once spoken, could never be taken back. They lived on in headlines, in memories, in the stories people told about you when you were not in the room. She had grown up believing that honesty was simple, that if you told the truth and worked hard, the world would see you clearly. Life had taught her otherwise. She was kind by nature, the sort of person who remembered small details about people, their children's names, their worries, the things that made them smile. But kindness, she discovered, could be mistaken for weakness. And in a world that watched her every move, weakness was something she could not afford. The days surrounding Archie's birth had been unlike anything she had imagined. She had thought about that moment for months, picturing it as something sacred and private, a threshold between one life and another. Instead, it had arrived wrapped in tension and expectation, with cameras waiting outside and questions she had not anticipated needing to answer. She remembered standing in the hospital room, holding her newborn son, feeling the weight of him in her arms and the weight of everything else pressing down from above. Harry had been beside her, protective and worried, and she had looked at him and said quietly, "We need to keep him safe." That was all that mattered in that moment. Not protocol, not tradition, not what people expected, just safety. The decisions that followed came quickly, too quickly perhaps. There were forms to complete, announcements to coordinate, details that needed confirming while her body was still recovering and her mind was still adjusting to the enormity of becoming a mother. She had tried to focus on what felt right, on what would shield her child from the scrutiny she had endured, but every choice seemed to carry consequences she could not fully predict. When they reviewed the birth certificate later, she remembered the conversation about wording. It had not felt significant at the time, just another administrative detail in a sea of them, but the person helping them had been careful, choosing phrases that were accurate without being complete, creating space where space might be needed. Meghan had nodded along, trusting that this was simply how things were done, that there was wisdom in the careful language of official documents. She had believed then, and still believed now, that clarity did not always mean saying everything. Sometimes protection required withholding certain details, not out of dishonesty but out of love. She thought of all the things she had not said over the years, all the hurts she had swallowed, all the corrections she had bitten back. Speaking up had so rarely brought her peace. More often, it had brought fresh waves of criticism, new reasons for people to doubt her motives. There was a particular exhaustion that came from being constantly misunderstood. She could explain herself a dozen different ways, and somehow the explanation would be twisted into proof of exactly what she was trying to disprove. So she had learned, painfully and slowly, that silence could be a kind of armor. Not the cold, hostile kind, but the protective sort that let her preserve what mattered most. Her son slept peacefully in the next room, unaware of the questions swirling around his existence. She watched him sometimes, marveling at his innocence, at the way he trusted the world completely. She wanted to keep that trust intact as long as possible. Every parent did, she supposed, but for her the stakes felt impossibly high. One wrong move, one misspoken word, and the machinery of public judgment would turn on him just as it had turned on her. Harry understood this, though it pained him. He had grown up inside that machinery, had seen what it did to people he loved. Together, they had decided that some things would remain private, that their son's early days would belong to them alone before they belonged to history. It had felt like a reasonable boundary, a small claim to normalcy in a life that was anything but normal. But boundaries, Meghan had learned, were often interpreted as barriers. Her desire for privacy was read as secrecy. Her careful words were examined for hidden meanings. Even her silence spoke, apparently, though never in the language she intended. She thought about her mother, who had taught her that dignity meant holding your head high even when the world tried to bow it. She thought about all the women who had been doubted, questioned, forced to prove themselves again and again. She thought about the cost of constantly defending your truth and the different cost of letting others define it for you. There were nights when she lay awake, turning it all over in her mind. Had they made the right choices? Should they have done things differently? But then morning would come, and Archie would wake with his small sounds, and she would lift him into her arms and remember why none of it mattered as much as he did. She had told Harry once, in a moment of exhaustion, "I just want him to be safe and loved." Is that really so much to ask? He had held her then, and she had felt the tremor in his hands, the way he carried his own weight of worry and helplessness. The truth was, she did not know if silence was protecting them or slowly dividing them from the family Harry had been born into. She saw the distance growing, felt it in the unanswered calls and the carefully formal statements. Part of her wanted to reach across that distance, to explain everything, to make them understand that she had never wanted any of this conflict. But another part of her, the part that had been hurt too many times, wondered if explanation would make any difference at all. Time, she kept telling herself, time would show them. Time would prove that her intentions had been good, that she had only ever wanted what any mother wanted. Time would reveal the truth in ways that words could not, but time was also cruel. It let misunderstandings harden into certainties. It allowed gaps to widen into chasms, and she could feel it happening, could sense the narrative forming around her, around them, around choices that had felt so simple in the moment, but looked so complicated from the outside. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden, where roses grew in wild abundance, untamed and beautiful. She had always preferred flowers that grew naturally, without too much pruning or control. There was honesty in that kind of growth, a refusal to be shaped into something it was not. Perhaps that was her mistake, she thought. Perhaps she had refused to be shaped when shaping was what was required. Or perhaps the real mistake was expecting to be accepted as she was, believing that love and good intentions would be enough. Archie made a sound from the other room, and she turned away from the window. Whatever questions existed, whatever doubts had been planted, they would have to wait. Right now, there was a child who needed her, and that was the only truth that mattered. The rest, the documents, the scrutiny, the careful silence would unfold as it would. She had done what she believed was right. Whether anyone else understood, that was beyond her control. She moved toward her son's room, carrying with her the hope that someday, somehow, the choices made in love would be recognized for what they were. The call he had been dreading. Harry was playing with Archie on the floor when his phone began to ring. The number showed William's name, and something in Harry's chest tightened before he even answered. Brothers know each other's rhythms, the spaces between words, the weight of a pause, and even across an ocean, Harry could sense that this call was different. He picked up, trying to sound casual. "Hey," William's voice came through measured, careful in that particular way that meant he was choosing every word with precision. "Harry, do you have a moment? I need to talk to you about something." The air in the room seemed to change. Harry glanced at Archie, who was babbling happily to himself, oblivious to the sudden tension crackling through the phone line. "Yeah, of course. What's going on?" There was a pause, just long enough to confirm Harry's instinct that something was wrong. When William spoke again, his tone carried concern rather than anger, but somehow that made it worse. Anger Harry could match, could fight against. Concern felt like quicksand. "I've been reviewing some documents," William began, and Harry's stomach dropped. "There are some questions about Archie's birth certificate. Nothing accusatory, but there are irregularities that need addressing." Harry stood up, moving away from his son, as though distance could protect the child from whatever was coming. "Irregularities?" The word felt heavy in his mouth. "What are you talking about?" William's explanation came in careful pieces, the spacing, the dates, the wording that seemed deliberately vague. He spoke like someone trying to be fair, trying to approach a difficult topic with gentleness. But all Harry could hear was doubt. Doubt about his son, doubt about his family, doubt about choices made during one of the most vulnerable moments of his life. "We didn't do anything wrong," Harry said, his voice harder than he intended. "We followed the process. We did what we were supposed to do." "I'm not saying you didn't," William replied. "I'm just trying to understand." "Understand what?" Harry interrupted. "That we wanted privacy? That we wanted to protect our son from exactly this kind of scrutiny?" The conversation was spiraling, and both brothers could feel it. Harry closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. His primary focus had always been Archie's future, his safety, his right to grow up without the weight of judgment that Harry himself had carried. Any suggestion that something was amiss felt like a direct threat to his son's identity, to the normal life Harry had fought so hard to create. He thought about Archie's face, the way his son looked at him with complete trust, believing his father could protect him from anything. What would it mean if even a birth certificate became a source of controversy? What kind of world was this, where a child's existence could not simply be celebrated but had to be documented, verified, questioned? "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Harry said quietly. "This is why we left." William's sigh came through the phone, heavy with his own frustration. "This isn't about that. This is about clarity, about making sure everything is proper." But Harry knew better. He had seen how quickly narratives could escape control, how a small question could become a loud headline, how whispers could solidify into accepted truths. He remembered his mother, the way stories had been told about her, the way her reality had been rewritten by people who claimed to know better. He remembered how helpless he had felt watching it happen, too young to fight back, too powerless to change the script. And now it was happening again, but this time it involved his son. "We didn't lie about anything," Harry said, hearing the defensive edge in his own voice and hating it. "If there's confusion, it's because we were trying to navigate an impossible situation." "Do you have any idea what those days were like? The pressure, the expectations, everyone wanting a piece of him before he'd even taken his first breath?" William was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "I'm trying to help, Harry. I'm trying to handle this quietly before it becomes something bigger." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they landed differently. "Before it becomes something bigger" implied that it was already something, that the seed of doubt had been planted and was now being tended, carefully and with concern, but tended nonetheless. Harry looked back at Archie, who had found one of his toys and was shaking it with pure delight. That joy, that innocence, it felt impossibly fragile in this moment. How could he explain to William that this was not about a document? This was about never being believed, about always having to prove yourself, about the exhausting work of defending your truth against people who had already decided what they wanted to think. "I need to go," Harry said. "Archie needs me." It was not entirely true. Archie was perfectly content, but Harry needed the conversation to end before he said something he could not take back. William started to protest, to suggest they talk this through properly, but Harry was already pulling the phone away from his ear. After he hung up, he sat on the floor beside his son and pulled him close. Archie laughed and grabbed at his father's face with small, sticky hands. Harry held him and tried to breathe through the fear rising in his chest. Was this really about a document, or was it about something deeper, something that had been broken long before any birth certificate was signed? Was it about never being believed, never being trusted to make your own decisions, never being free of the assumption that you were somehow getting it wrong. He did not have answers. He only had his son, warm and real in his arms, and the terrible knowledge that protecting him might require fighting battles. Harry was already tired of fighting. The phone sat silent beside him, but the conversation was far from over. The paper between them, the birth certificate, was not a person, yet it somehow held more power than anyone in the room. It sat on the polished mahogany desk, crisp and formal, stamped with seals that were meant to convey authority and finality. Just paper and ink, really nothing that could breathe or speak or defend itself, but it had become something more than that. It had become a mirror, reflecting back whatever the person looking at it most feared or most needed to believe. The document itself was unremarkable in many ways. Name, date, location, all the standard fields filled in with the expected information. The language was proper, technical in the way official records always are, using phrases that sound important precisely because they reveal so little. A legal expert examining it would see nothing scandalous, nothing that violated procedure or law. It followed the rules, more or less, staying carefully within the boundaries of what was permissible. But rules have shadows, and it was in those shadows that trouble grew. The spacing between certain dates felt deliberate, as though someone had needed just enough room to make everything fit without lying outright. The wording around specific details carried an ambiguity that was probably intentional, crafted to be true from one angle while leaving other angles conveniently unexplored. Nothing was false. Exactly. But nothing was entirely transparent either. A clerk processing such a document would barely pause. They saw hundreds of these, thousands perhaps, and had learned to look for specific red flags, missing signatures, impossible dates, clear contradictions. This certificate had none of those problems. It was technically sound, properly executed, filed according to protocol. From a legal standpoint, it existed in that comfortable middle ground between flawless and flawed. But families do not read documents the way clerks do. William had studied the certificate with the eye of someone trained to notice patterns, someone who understood institutions and their quiet languages. He saw the gaps between words, the careful construction of phrases that answered questions while avoiding others. To him, it felt like a door left slightly ajar, not wide open, not locked tight, but hovering in that uncertain space where doubt could slip through. He did not see malice in the document. He saw something perhaps more troubling, the evidence of decisions made under pressure, of choices that prioritized one kind of truth over another. It troubled him not because it was clearly wrong, but because it was uncomfortably unclear. Harry, on the other hand, looked at the same paper and saw an attack, not on him personally, though it felt personal, but on his family's integrity. He saw the document as proof of nothing except the impossible situation they had been placed in, forced to navigate royal expectations while trying to protect something precious and new. Every carefully worded phrase was not evidence of deception but of survival. To him, questioning the certificate meant questioning everything: his judgment, his wife's character, his son's legitimacy, in ways that went far beyond legal technicalities. It meant suggesting that their desire for privacy was actually concealment, that their attempt to do things differently was actually doing things wrong. Meghan saw yet another version when she finally forced herself to look at it again. She saw the exhaustion of those days, the confusion of trying to satisfy requirements she had never fully understood. She saw the advice given by people who were supposed to know better, the assurances that this was simply how things were done. She had trusted the process, signed what she was told to sign, believed that following guidance meant doing things correctly. Now that trust felt like naivety. The document that was supposed to be routine had become evidence in a trial she had not realized was beginning. The gap between legal meaning and emotional meaning had become a chasm. Officials could look at the certificate and see compliance with regulation, boxes properly checked, procedures adequately followed. But family members looked at the same document and felt accusation, defense, betrayal, and hurt swirling around its margins. The real danger was not what the document said, but how it was interpreted. Each person brought their own history to the reading. William brought memories of institutional fractures, of small irregularities that had once spiraled into larger crises. Harry brought the trauma of being disbelieved, of watching his mother's truth be rewritten by others. Meghan brought the weariness of having her every choice scrutinized and found wanting. They were all reading the same words, but seeing entirely different meanings. The certificate had become a kind of test, revealing less about the facts of Archie's birth and more about the fissures already existing in the family's foundation. An outside observer might have found the whole situation baffling. How could a simple administrative document cause such upheaval? But that was precisely the point. It was never simple. Not in a family where every choice carried historical weight, where privacy was constantly negotiating with duty, where love competed with institution for priority. The paper sat silent through all of it, unchanged by the emotions swirling around it. It could not defend its own meaning or clarify its own purpose. It simply existed, a fixed point around which interpretations spun in increasingly distant orbits. Misunderstanding, it seemed, was far more powerful than intention. What someone meant when they filled out a form mattered less than what someone else believed they meant. The document's creators could insist they had acted in good faith, but good faith could not control how their choices would later be perceived. And so the birth certificate, meant to be a beginning, a formal welcome into the world, had become something else entirely. It had become the paper between them, dividing where it should have united, raising questions where it should have provided answers. The tragedy was that everyone involved probably believed they were acting correctly, yet somehow, correctness had led them here. Staring at the same piece of paper and seeing completely different truths, each one real to the person holding it, none of them quite reconcilable with the others. When brothers stop reaching, William had always been the careful one, the brother who thought before he spoke, who weighed consequences with the seriousness of someone who knew his words would one day shape a nation. But beneath that measured exterior was a man who loved deeply, who remembered childhood games and shared secrets, who had once promised his younger brother that they would always have each other's backs. He had meant it then, he still meant it now, even as the distance between them grew into something that felt unbridgeable. Harry was different, quicker to feel, faster to react, his heart always closer to the surface. As a boy, he had been the one who made William laugh, who pulled him into mischief when duty threatened to make him too serious too soon. They had been each other's refuge in a world that watched them constantly. Two boys who understood what it meant to grow up in a spotlight neither had chosen. Now they were two men standing on opposite sides of something neither could quite name. The phone call had been arranged carefully, scheduled for a time when no one else would be listening. No advisors, no partners, no witnesses. Just the two of them, trying to find their way through a conversation that felt like walking through fog. William started gently. "I'm not trying to attack you. I hope you know that." There was silence on the other end, and William could picture his brother's face, the way Harry's jaw would tighten when he was trying to control his anger. Finally, Harry spoke. "Then what are you trying to do?" "I'm trying to understand," William said. "There are questions that need answering, and I thought it would be better coming from me than from someone else." "Questions," Harry repeated, his voice hollow. "About my son, about whether we were honest about his birth." William closed his eyes. This was already going wrong, spiraling away from the careful approach he had planned. "It's not about honesty. It's about clarity. The document has irregularities, and if we don't address them now, someone else will find them and make them into something they're not. Or maybe they're nothing at all," Harry shot back. "Maybe you're looking for problems because you can't accept that we wanted to do things our own way. That's not fair, isn't it?" Harry's voice cracked slightly. "You've never trusted that I could make my own decisions. Even when I was trying to protect my family, trying to give my son a life that wasn't suffocated by all of this, you questioned it." William felt his own frustration rising. "I questioned it because I care, because I know what happens when things aren't handled properly. I'm trying to help you, Harry. Why can't you see that?" But Harry could only hear judgment. Every carefully chosen word from his brother sounded like doubt, like the assumption that Harry had done something wrong, that his choices were suspect. It was a pattern worn deep over years. William the responsible one, Harry the reckless one, William the future king, Harry the spare who could never quite measure up. "I didn't do anything wrong," Harry said quietly. "We were exhausted, we were overwhelmed, and we did the best we could. If that's not good enough for you, I don't know what else to say." William leaned forward, pressing his palm against his forehead. "I'm not saying it's not good enough. I'm saying there are questions, and we need to have answers ready." "We?" Harry's laugh was bitter. "There is no we anymore, William. You made that clear a long time ago." The words landed like a blow. William wanted to argue, to push back against the accusation, but something in him faltered. When had they stopped being we? When had the space between them widened from a crack into a canyon? "I never wanted this," William said, his voice softer now. "I never wanted us to be on opposite sides." "Then stop treating me like I'm your subject instead of your brother." The silence that followed was thick with everything they were not saying. William feared losing his brother completely, feared that if he pushed too hard, Harry would disappear entirely from his life, taking his family with him. But he also feared what would happen if he did nothing, if irregularities became scandals, if questions became accusations from people far less kind than himself. Harry feared something different but equally painful. He feared never being believed, never being trusted to know what was best for his own family. He feared that no matter what he did, he would always be seen as the problem, the one who needed fixing, the one who could not be left to his own devices. Neither brother spoke these fears aloud. Instead, they let the silence stretch between them, heavy and sad. Finally, William said, "I don't want to lose you." Harry's response was barely a whisper, "Then stop looking for reasons to doubt me." The call ended shortly after, both men too tired to continue, too hurt to find the bridge back to each other. William sat alone in his study, staring at the document that had started all of this, wondering if he had just made everything worse. Harry stood by the window in his home across the ocean, watching the evening settle over the garden, wondering if there would ever be a time when he and his brother could simply be brothers again. What happens when brothers stop reaching for each other? The answer hung in the space between them, unspoken but undeniable. They drift, slowly at first, then faster, until one day they wake up and realize they have become strangers who once shared everything. Neither wanted that, but neither knew how to stop it from happening. The wounds that remain. Harry was the kind of father who kept his promises. He had vowed, long before Archie was born, that his son would grow up feeling protected, cherished, never doubted. Yet here he was, sitting in the quiet of early morning, holding that promise in his hands and feeling it crumble. The conversation with William had ended days ago, but it lived on in Harry's chest like an ache that would not fade. It was not really about the document anymore. Perhaps it never had been. What cut deepest was the feeling of being questioned by the one person who should have known better, who should have understood without needing explanations. Harry had spent his whole life defending himself, proving he was not the problem everyone assumed he was. He had thought that distance might finally free him from that burden. He had been wrong. He looked at Archie sleeping peacefully nearby, small chest rising and falling with perfect trust. "I'm sorry," Harry whispered, though his son could not hear him. Sorry that even birth could not be simple. Sorry that love was not enough to shield him from doubt. Across the ocean, William sat at the same desk where this had all begun, the birth certificate filed away now but still heavy in his thoughts. He had meant well. That defense felt hollow now, childish even. Meaning well did not erase the distance he heard in Harry's voice during their last call, did not soften the finality in the way his brother had said goodbye. Leadership, William had always believed, meant asking difficult questions, but leadership was lonely when asking those questions cost you the people you loved most. He wondered if he should have stayed silent, if some things were better left unexamined. The uncertainty gnawed at him in ways that felt uncomfortably familiar. The truth was, nothing had been resolved. No dramatic revelation had emerged, no clear answer that made everything simple again. The document remained what it had always been, a piece of paper that raised more questions than it answered. But those questions had done their damage, opening wounds that might never fully close. The family moved forward because that was what families did. They attended the same events when necessary, exchanged the required pleasantries, maintained the public appearance of unity. But privately, something fundamental had shifted. Trust, once given freely between brothers, now came with conditions neither could quite articulate. Harry carried his devastation quietly, channeling it into fierce protection of his small family. William carried his regret the same way, wondering late at night if seeking truth had been worth losing closeness. Neither spoke of it openly. Both felt it constantly. Can a family heal without complete answers? The question hung over them all. Harry, William, Meghan, and the institution that bound them together, whether they wanted it or not. Perhaps healing did not require answers. Perhaps it required something harder. The willingness to sit with discomfort, to accept that some things would never be fully understood, to choose connection over certainty. But that kind of healing demanded more grace than any of them had left to give, and so they remained changed, separate, intact but fractured, a family held together by blood and history while everything else slowly came undone.